third Pokemon Retrospective. So, welcome back everyone. Yep, that is of course right. Let's take a look at the DS Pokemon games, starting with the 4th generation of Pokemon, Diamond and Pearl. So, these games were released in 2007 and were the first games on the DS for the for the mainline Pokemon series. And, well, let's take a look at them real quick. So, Diamond and Pearl are really interesting games in both good and bad ways. They're interesting in good ways because they brought quite a bit to the table in regards, for new features, such as the underground, the physical special split, where or not moves connected or not really dependent on whether or not they were physical or not, and not just the typings. They also introduced quite a few new Pokemon, some of which being evolutions of older Pokemon, although they also kind of locked behind quite a few Pokemon in the post game, which kind of sucks. And the games themselves also were a little slow. And insert, that one video of the Heracross knocking out the Blissey. Overall, while Diamond and Pearl are good games, they are flawed, not perfect. And while I do still enjoy them, they definitely still do have, their issues. Fortunately, Platinum would kind of fix some of these. Pokemon Platinum came out on a DS in 2009 and was the third version, and pretty much kind of an updated version of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Overall, Pokemon Platinum was actually pretty good. I mean, it fixed quite a bit of the issues with Diamond and Pearl, such as reintroducing the Pokemon that had gone left out of the Sinnoh Pokedex, fixing up the story, making Giratina the front and center for part of the story, improving Team Galactic, and also introducing Looker in the series. And overall, Platinum was a really good Pokemon game. While it did still keep some features from Diamond and Pearl, it did also improve on them, such as the ability to transfer more than 6 Pokemon a day, and also improved the game's speed, as Diamond and Pearl were kind of slow. Platinum is still slow itself. It does feel like it does go by a little faster at times. Then, of course, it did improve the story. It made, a lot more Pokemon available, because Pokemon Diamond and Pearl really only had some Pokemon available in the post-game, and you also had to have a Gen 3 game inserted into your DS for some of these Pokemon. Platinum made it easier to obtain these Pokemon, and overall, Platinum is probably the definitive version of the Sinnoh games. At least for now. We'll kind of get to that later. But of course, what are my thoughts on the Sinnoh series? Overall, I think the Sinnoh games are honestly wonderful. Sinnoh is probably one of my favorite Pokemon regions, and there's a lot of memories associated with Sinnoh itself, from the anime, to the manga, to the games, and just overall, it makes this region extremely nostalgic for me, and it's always fun being able to go through it all over again. And I'm hoping to see more stuff like this in the future. But of course, we'll be moving on to the next Pokemon games. Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver were released in 2010 and were remakes of Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Mainly Gold and Silver, and obviously the names, but quite a few parts of Crystal do make it into Heart Gold and Soul Silver, such as the Suicune encounters. Those were introduced in Crystal, actually, because before in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Suicune was just a normal roaming legendary. But with Crystal, they gave Suicune more of a spotlight. It would roam around the region, waiting for you to encounter it, and eventually you could capture it, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver keeps that. Heart Gold and Soul Silver also introduces quite a few new features into the series, such as the return of following Pokemon. All Pokemon can follow you. While this was a thing in previous Pokemon games, it was limited to who could follow you. Pokemon Yellow only had Pikachu be able to follow you. Diamond Pearl was only your starters and I think a few select Pokemon. Platinum didn't improve on that, But Heart Gold and Soul Silver, all 493 Pokemon, provided you had them, could follow you. You literally could walk through town with a Dialga walking behind you. I mean, that's, well, the god of time in Pokemon, you know. I guess he just likes his walks. Or their walks. I mean, Dialga doesn't really have a gender. But of course, other things that Heart Gold and Soul Silver did improve on was, of course, the level curves. This is still an issue in the game, though, because, well, some Pokemon are quite a lower level. But grinding did feel a little easier in this game. It also did get easier because, with all the other stuff that previous generations have had in, those on Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, such as out of battle abilities and the physical special split. So finding that lucky egg is much more easier. You just kind of gotta get a bit luckier, I guess. But they also add a few new dex entries for some Pokemon. So Pokemon like Ambipom and Yanmega, who evolve through learning other moves, are now available in the Heart Gold and Soul Silver Pokedex. Because before then, they just stopped your Pokemon from evolving. That Crobat you worked the entire game for, yeah, screw you not getting until the post game, which is quite a huge thing for these games because it generally felt like there was a bit more freedom in these games. Not to mention, they also have Lyra as a character. She replaces Chris, but is still a really interesting character. They also further flesh out Silver as a character as well, and also give some. Well, they also kind of give some more personality to the Team Rocket members, which thankfully they did because, well, in the originals, they didn't really have much of a personality. I mean, you had Archer and I think Ariana, but Proton and Petrol, I don't really think they had names in the originals. I could be wrong though. But of course, probably the biggest example of change with Heart Gold and Soul Silver is definitely the Safari Zone. It was re-added in this game and was really impressive. Also, kind of a giant pain. I still remember that Solak that took 3 months to appear, and I'm still upset about that. But it allowed you to capture Pokemon that went in the Johto region, through, placing objects, which is fun, but also kind of a pain to deal with. But was still fun for the most part. And of course, there's all sorts of other tiny things that Heart Gold and Soul Silver added that really just make it a really impressive game. And while the game is flawed, it is still worth playing if you can get your hands on a copy. But what are our thoughts on Gen 4 and Johto? Well, it's fun returning to Johto. Johto's a fun region, and as for Gen 4, this was a marvelous generation. Yeah, I like the references that Davin Pill have in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, well, for the Johto region, such as Jasmine being a character, or the Red Gyarados mentioned. So it's also, and it's pretty cool getting to see some other gym leaders appear in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. That's one of the coolest things about the remakes, is that they get to go back and add a few new things to make it more lively. Like, Fire Wind Leaf Green mentions Brawly. They also have a appearance by Janine, Koga's daughter, and Oras also introduced quite a few other characters as well. They have some references to X and Y, and BDSP, I'm not entirely sure, but Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee have a reference to Mina from the, Gen 7 Pokemon games, so it's generally really cool being able to see these characters appear in outside games, because it just gives you a moment to be like, oh, I remember them. But of course, we'll be moving on to the 5th generation of Pokemon. Pokemon Black and White were released in 2011 and are, well, they're controversial. Pokemon Black and White are generally really fun Pokemon games. Very controversial, though, because, well, they kind of rebooted the series and were kind of unpopular for a bit. I do think that these games are really good. There's a lot that they introduced into the series that is, that was fun. Triple battles and rotation battles were kind of a smart idea. Were not the best implemented in our opinion, but having to use nothing but Unova Pokemon for a first playthrough was generally a really genius idea, albeit a bit controversial to some of the fans. And the amount of stuff that this game had to deal with is honestly sad, because these are really good games. And while the anime and manga aren't perfect, they still made Unova feel like a wonderful region. Black and White are very fun Pokemon games, and there's definitely a lot more appreciation for them, during these days. But there's also some people trying to kind of retcon the fact that these games are ever hated, which is odd. It's very odd, to be honest, because you know, they should just admit that these games did have a lot of hate, but people starting to appreciate them even more. So I don't really get the fact that some people just try to deny that Gen 5 games were hated. So what are some other things that Gen 5 did well? Well, there's unbreakable TMs. TMs are, able to be used forever and ever, which was honestly a really good idea because, you could change your team's moveset at any time and not really have to worry about replacing TMs. They also kind of made HMs a bit redundant because it's not really required to progress through the game. Sure, you do need to use HMs still, but for the most part, you don't really have to. Then there's also the characters and, the region. They're all fun. So all in all, Pokemon Black and White were arguably some of the best Pokemon games that we've actually gotten. Then, of course, came 2012, and we got one of the best games. Pokemon Black and White were released on 2012 and were the final Pokemon games on the DS. So the DS is going out with a huge bang. Not really surprising because, each of these consoles kind of went out with some really great Pokemon games. But of course, at this time, the 3DS was already out, and so it's probably obvious that, new Pokemon games are probably going to be on the 3DS. I've even had some people say that Black and White should have been on the 3DS, actually, which I can agree with, but I feel like Nintendo wanted to finish up the 5th generation, and probably give more people time to get the new consoles. But of course, what's so special about Black and White, too? Well, they're just fun Pokemon games. The story is just magnificent. There's a bunch of returning Pokemon, so you can customize your teams even further. The characters are amazing, and Kyurem gets a new form. We didn't really need a third Pokemon version, but having sequels definitely improved Gen 5 quite a bit, because, we get to see what happened to some of these characters after the events of the game. Churn and Bianca, for example, we get to see what happened to them. They're not trainers anymore. Well, they're not exactly, the trainers that they were years ago, but, Churn's a gym leader, and Bianca is helping the professor, which is really cool, because we get to see them pursue their own goals. We also have the return of Anne. We have the return of Ghetsis. We even have new characters introduced. And overall, Black and White 2 are really amazing Pokemon games, and honestly, I really wish I could go back and play these for the first time, because they're generally among some of the best Pokemon games. Just the story in general was just absolutely amazing, and they incorporated it well into the anime as well. Pokemon Black and White are honestly really fantastic games, and definitely do deserve a playthrough. So, of course, I guess what are our thoughts on Black and White and the Gen 5 Pokemon games as a whole, along with the DS Pokemon games? Well, our thoughts for Black and White and Black and White 2, they're absolutely fun games. There's definitely a lot that we've said about these, such as, characters, the region, Pokemon, all fantastic. While there are some flaws, like the Fun Fest missions just kind of feeling forced in and can only get and this is like the only way that you can get Stunky and Clamio without trading, well, transferring, and the fact that Zora is locked behind a event in black and white is also kind of odd. These games are also really fantastic and generally were a special time in the Pokemon series. And again, they do deserve the praise that they get. As for the DS line of Pokemon games, this was definitely a special time to be a Pokemon fan. Sure, we missed out on this and weren't able to play these games until really years after they were released, but being able to experience them for the first time and being able to really just go up on YouTube and be able to just hear about these games and just how much they changed the series was generally really amazing, and it made us look forward to them even more, and it was fun getting to experience these, and they still remain a wonderful part of our game collection. Obviously, we'll be moving on to the 3DS line of Pokemon games. This will, of course, include the Gen 6 games, the Gen 1 ports, and most of the Gen 7 games, because, well, Let's Go is a Switch game. So, obviously, next time we'll be saying goodbye to the 3DS, and being nostalgic all over that. But of course, this was our Pokemon retrospective. Yeah. We obviously plan to do more videos like this here in the future. So definitely stay tuned for videos like that if that's interesting. And I hope you all have a wonderful day or night, and catch you all later.